So what the heck am I wearing? I am wearing a Windows Tukwila t-shirt. What's Windows Tukwila, you ask? That's NT 3.99, which you may not recall because, of course, it was never actually released. So what I thought I would do is kind of ramble about that and a few other topics while we accumulate through Glenn, the awesome moderator, other Glenn, some topics for us to actually answer. Windows NT 3.99. There was kind of a bifurcation of the NT camp into Cairo and let's do incremental work. So we're the people who wanted to do Cairo, and there was a grand vision for Cairo with object-oriented file systems that ran as a database and so on and so forth, and a whole new shell that was still in design, and a number of features that were going to solve all the problems. And then there were people like me who like to just add an incremental feature, ship it, add an incremental feature, ship it, and kind of repeat that process. And that's the way I worked. And there's a lot of people that work that way as well. The problem was Cairo was such a big leap that it didn't seem like we were ever going to get there. And no matter how much progress we made, it seemed equally far away. And I think what Tukwila was, even though it wasn't a real thing, it was just a t-shirt and kind of an internal campaign. It was pushback on the idea of Cairo being too far, too much, too bold, too far away. Tukwila, which is a small town near Seattle, as opposed to Cairo being over in Egypt, is much closer. And that's the slogan. We can get there from here. So that explains the t-shirt or golf shirt, whatever the heck. So I actually liked it, but I always thought it was a bit of a middle finger to the Cairo guys. So when we had the 25th year reunion, I was pretty hesitant and I didn't wear it, even though I kind of really wanted to because it's rather unique. They only gave out a few of them to a couple people. I thought it'd be cool, but nah, discretion is the better part of valor. So I thought, no, I won't wear it. And I walk in the front door and who's standing there? Dave Cutler, and he's wearing his Tukwila shirt. So he was a little bolder than me, or I overthought it or he underthought it, one of the two. So let me flip over here to my other screen so that I can check and see what Glenn has accumulated here for messages. Did I know Gordon Letwin? I did not know Gordon Letwin, the architect of OS2, although the guy that hired me was interviewed by Gordon Letwin as his as appropriate. I just figured that out a couple days ago. Small Gordon Letwin story. When I moved to a building called Red West, which was kind of one of the newest buildings, and so therefore it was a little cheaper. Each building got a little more, I guess we should say economical, as they learned how to build buildings more economically. And where I had, actual nameplate on my door at the old building, I just had paper that went in an acrylic housing. And so you could put whatever you wanted on there. And I put Gordon Letwin, and I used that as my name tag on my door because I wanted to see how many people would get it. And I figured he actually was still on the payroll and worked at Microsoft, but did not have an office. And I figured that'd be nice. He could share with me. Nobody knew who Gordon Letwin was. So I thought that was kind of weird. And it wasn't late 90s, actually. It was early 2000s, but even by then, most of the developers, wandering around the hallways and coming to my office, they would look at the door. They'd know the name was wrong, but they didn't know who Gordon was. So I found that kind of interesting. Did Microsoft ever try their hand at chip manufacturing back then? Not to my knowledge. Now, what went on in the research, the R&D groups, who's to say, because that was pretty far removed from where I was. But in terms of the product groups, just the Xbox stuff would be, and there might be some mobile stuff as well, but in terms of desktop computing, like the M1 chip, not to my knowledge. They were probably involved with the IA64 instruction set where you had HP, Intel, and a whole bunch of companies got together and, as committees tend to produce something that is not actually ever in use today, but that's the closest they came. What are your thoughts on the state of C#? Is it something you use? I love C#. It is literally my favorite language. I work in it whenever I can, although I've never been paid to do so. I did not work in C# at all at Microsoft. Everything I did there was either assembly or C or C++. But I used C# a great deal in my own projects at home. I've written a number of fairly large scale things. And the latest thing I wrote, which is the LED controller software, all the server-side software that runs either on a Pi or on your NAS or on, anywhere that you can run Linux or Windows or Mac. The server-side stuff is entirely C#. And I really had a lot of fun writing it because it's just a great language to work in. You don't get burned by stupid little mistakes because the compiler catches most of those kinds of things. And it's a language that I feel very expressive and productive in. So how big of a challenge was it for the NT team to upgrade Windows NT4 to Windows 2000 when the integration of Active Directory group policy and DNS? We actually had a pretty clean split between desktop and server side. And so all the server side stuff was really a different team that I didn't interact with all that much, except as a user. So we were a large org because we had, I don't know, 10,000 people in the NT group and 100,000 people in the company eventually. I don't know if it was that big when I was there, but maybe it was like 50,000 at least. And we went through the growing pains of having a large single DS and not having a Active Directory even before that, of course, where everybody downloaded their mail address book every morning. That was pretty painful. You'd come in, and the first thing you'd do was you'd run to your desk and you'd start MS Mail, and it would then kick off the address book download for the day, which would take, I don't know, 20 minutes, half an hour, depending how many people were doing it. And it downloaded the directory of everybody at the company, which was probably 10,000 people at that time. So 10,000 people downloading 10,000. Yeah, that's a lot. So we were happy to pick up Active Directory and so on as users, but I did not have a great deal to do with it in terms of the coding. I did own some group policy stuff and the disk quota. That's as close as I got. Do you prefer Unix-like systems over Windows? So this is a bigger general topic. This is probably the most frequently asked topic that I get. It was, did Windows developers at Microsoft know about Linux? Did they look at Linux? Did they use Linux? Did they take feature ideas from Linux? And so on and so forth. I get a lot of these questions, and the answer by and large is no. Now, there were a number of us, like myself. I started using Linux in 1992. I was really fascinated. I liked Xenix. I liked BSD, but for some reason I couldn't get a copy of BSD, and Xenix was commercial. So I had a friend that actually had a PDP-11 in their dining room in their house. Well, instead of their dining room furniture, they had a PDP-11. And I always had Unix envy because of that. And I really wanted to set something up. And so when I got the opportunity to do so with Linux, I was in there like a dirty shirt. The thing is, back then, if you could build it, deploy it, and boot it, that was pretty heroic. I did manage to do so, but I don't remember how long it took to do it. What I wound up with was a pretty limited Unix-like system, because Linux in the very early days was pretty limited. I remember sitting down with the System 5 Release 4 manual, the big monster book, and going through and just finding what worked and what didn't, and annotating in my book and keeping track of that kind of thing. So I was pretty interested in it, and that's largely a function of having been at college at the time. And because everything we did was basically PDP-11 stuff, and VMS was just used for a few things. Most of the hardcore CS stuff was still done on PDP for some reason. And that meant we were all pretty good with Unix-like stuff and C and so forth in this particular school. When I got to Microsoft, you could tell almost nobody used it whatsoever. On the server side, they certainly, the PMs on the server side, obviously, were very familiar with Unix from the enterprise standpoint in order to be competitive with it or target features and so on. But in terms of desktop, since I was in the UI shell team, it's not like there was really anything going on in the Linux desktop space that we were like, wow, I never thought of that. You know, they had icons, and it was really basic. If you look at Red Hat in the 90s, I think Red Hat was the distribution I probably saw the most of back then. So maybe it's Fedora, Red Hat. Are they the same thing? Is that the company and the product? Those are the two names I remember anyway. So I don't think there was a lot of awareness, but of the people that mattered, there was respect for Linux, and there was an understanding of what it did well. And certainly on the operating system side, they were familiar with it, and they targeted it, and they ran benchmarks, and we did that. We went to meetings where they would bring up, here's how fast it is to do this file operation set 1 million times under Linux, or under some other Unix. Actually, it wasn't Linux. And here it is under Windows. And it depends if you write the code using NT-create file versus fopen is really what it comes down to. Do you have an abstraction layer in between? And that's something I actually just produced a video on, wherein I go through and produce a custom a custom Linux kernel and deploy it to my machine and show you how to go through and do that. And so that'll be out on Monday or Tuesday following this video. Why did Microsoft decide to put some actual work into activation for Windows XP, but it was ignored with Windows 95? Windows 95 less important than XP? No, but I think it was likely, you got to remember, Windows 95 did not even come with TCP IP, I don't think. I think that might have been in the Plus pack. The first service pack Windows 95 had TCP/IP, but it's not like people were online and there was no appetite, I imagine, for having 50 million people phone up by phone and do telephone activation. So I don't think it became practical until a couple of years later, more like the XP timeframe, when pretty much, I won't say everybody, but the majority of people at least had some kind of access to internet dial-up, at least, so that they go through and activate their software. So that's probably the biggest part, was the enabling feature. Also, we picked up a lot of stuff for free, quote unquote, because Office had done activation. So we were able to get a lot of their code in terms of the hard technical stuff of obfuscation and protection and that kind of thing, and reuse those aspects. So there was some economy of scale as well. What was the time like leading up to Y2K? Primarily, we were working on XP, and I think we were working on XP at that time. I got a printed timeline of operating systems because I know what I worked on and I know roughly what order, but I don't map them well to the dates that I actually worked on them. I believe that's primarily XP or XP, SP1, SP2. No, it wasn't SP2. That was a security push that came later. So there was not a lot of date handling in Windows, to be honest. Certainly creation dates and all that, but they had that figured out. They weren't putting 2-digit dates in any version of Windows, as far as I can think of, that matters. It's not like we had to go and hunt down 2-digit dates in the code, because everything was going to be done as a positive offset from a date back in 1970, which is how dates are tracked in Unix time. And there are other methods for Windows time, but either way, that doesn't roll over for a long time. So that's what they said about Win2K, but I mean a very long time. What's your favorite Windows release? I think my favorite Windows release is actually not numbered. It is NT 351 plus the Win95 shell ported to Windows NT. We called it SUR, S-U-R, shell update release. There was a batch file you ran that then installed our new binaries on top of NT 351. Pretty sure it was 351. And that gave you the Win95 UI before NT4 came out with it. So it was basically our UI upgrade kit for the previous version of NT. And it was basically, I don't remember how many guys were on it, but it was small. It was like 4 core developers maybe. And there was people working on, COM control and COM dialog and the bigger pieces like that as well. But in terms of the shell, it was maybe 2 or 3 guys, 4 guys at most. So it was nice to see the whole thing actually up and running. There's a picture of me in my office. You might have seen a couple of videos because I've used the picture a couple of times. It's the only picture I have of my old office, where I'm standing there. I got a Bob shirt on, and there's a dollar bill pinned to the corkboard. What's going on there is I was responsible for porting the Explorer.exe process to the Win32 NT Unicode aligned MIPS RISC Alpha PowerPC. All of those changes came about at one time. And we had to rewrite, basically, not rewrite, but adapt and rewrite, adapt/and/or rewrite all of the old code for this new platform. We did that, and we got to the point where it compiled. And we had a bet. I had a bet with Bob Day across the hall as to how far it would actually make it, because we had done a lot of automated things in terms of changing size of to a particularly smarter macro that would handle Unicode and so on and so forth. So we had all these changes that were all kind of nebulous, and you knew something was going to break somewhere. But how far would it make it? Would it, DLL process attach, boom, or was it going to make it further? And I said, we're going to at least see some icons, or we're going to see some boxes where icons should be. And Bob said, no, it's going to blow up in like some early, like in Maine or somewhere really early. I forget exactly what he said, but it was a little more pessimistic. Anyway, long story short, it came up, it booted up, it ran all the way to the desktop, and then it sat there with the mouse, and it looked at us. And then I was pretty stoked. So I think as soon as I tried to do anything substantive, it then blew up. But I mean, it got that far, first compile. So we were pretty happy with that. And so that's probably why it became one of my favorite releases, if not my favorite release. Can you tell us something about the competition with OS2? I cannot, because basically they killed OS2, and then I came along and I worked on NT. So I was not somebody that was there from the OS2 team, and I didn't come over from DEC. I came in just at that time in 93. So I wasn't there for any of the drama that went on with the cancellation of OS2. I wasn't married to OS2 or any of those things. I do know a guy that was my manager, and he was involved with OS2 and worked on OS2 and was there when OS2 got killed and so on and so forth. Probably participated in the decision as far as I know. So I'm going to be doing an interview with him, and he was there for MS-DOS and the Stack lawsuit and Internet Explorer, the first versions. So if you have any questions related to the first versions of Internet Explorer, MS-DOS 6, that era, Stack, the compression algorithm in particular, any of those things, let us know, and I'll keep track of those questions, and I will make sure they get asked when he's in the hot seat. How do you feel about the direction that Microsoft has taken regarding large feature changes in Windows 10 major versions instead of iterative versions? I'm a big fan of smaller changes more often. So I kind of like, I don't know if Apple is a good example of that. There seem to be more frequent upgrades, but in terms of features versus bug fixes, I can't really say which company pushes them out faster. I would say, however, that I would prefer that there are features that I would like to see that seem really far away, like processor re-virtualization on AMD, so that if I virtualize my processor and I run a hypervisor and I bring up Windows on a hypervisor, can it then virtualize its processor out as well? And there's scenarios like Docker where you really want to be able to do that. I'm not sure if that's in the main code yet, and it's been done for, or not done, but it's been in for a long time, but I don't think it's made it to the public release branch. So it seems to take quite a while for features to percolate into the main tree. So they're very conservative. I do wish, as a user, it were faster. As somebody writing operating systems, I would, bite off smaller chunks, chew a little more, and spit it out more often. That's a terrible analogy, but that's what you get for making them up on the fly. Can you talk about what programming languages Microsoft uses for different parts of Windows and why? There are really only 3 languages. There's going to be a tiny amount of assembly in the HAL, the hardware abstraction layer, which is what takes the actual CPU, motherboard, that combination, and exposes it in a way that can be written to with C. So it's really just the code you need to get C up and running, more or less. From there, you have a bunch of stuff that is, especially down in the kernel, that is still C itself. I believe, if I'm right, user 32 is still C, GDI is C, shell 32 was C, but is now C++. But shell 32 was a bit crazy. They were so memory constrained on Win95, and they were so sensitive and diligent about memory that what they did was they had their own mini-com that was not really COM. It knew how to call through a QI pointer and get an interface handle or some really basic functionality, but couldn't do anything more than that until you actually needed real COM, at which point it would then reload the real COM and then let it do the work. But it kept the memory footprint much smaller for a much longer time. The difference also was they were not using C++. They were using C, but they were still using classes and COM objects. And you're like, well, how do you do that? Well, you actually code a vtable into your object with a bunch of function pointers at the beginning, and it knows that, hey, this looks exactly like a C++ object when laid out in memory. And that's what they did. So that was C++ written in C, basically. And then at some point, they just said, we're just going to go to C++. And that was with the NT port, I believe. Dave, have you done much gaming over the years? If so, what were some of your favorite games from various eras? I was a big arcade game player when I was a young kid. I held and still hold the world record on the arcade game Tempest, and I believe Space Duel, which is a less known game. But Tempest, I have one here in the house, and I play periodically. I go through spells where I play it about 20 minutes a day, every day. And I'll do that for a couple months, and then I'll unplug it. Pardon me, bump the mic. Then I will unplug it and not look at the thing again for 6 months. And then I will, hey, look, I have a Tempest machine, and I'll start over in this cycle. So it depends what I'm doing. I also really got into Geometry Wars 3 on the Xbox, which probably looks like Tempest. But so it's not just color vector RGB games, but it is that particular gaming model where it's simple, casual gaming that is incredibly easy to pick up. Not that Tempest is easy to pick up, but really hard to master. The nice thing for me about Tempest is I can play it. There's only 100 levels. Well, that's a lot of levels, but there are 100 levels. And I can make it through fairly easily to about level 90, at which point I start to bog down and die off pretty reliably. So it's interesting. rewarding, fascinating, and frustrating that way back 40 years ago, they designed a game that adapted or has a ramp of difficulty that is gradual enough that 40 years later, I'm still up against the slope of it. I haven't, got frustrated with the game, and I haven't run past the game in difficulty and, found it to be easy. Some games like Asteroids, you would just master really quickly. I have not played a lot of first-person shooters, Battle Royale, that kind of thing. The last game that I actually played was Max Payne. And this is probably Max Payne 1.0, the first one. And the reason I can play it is second person. So the camera follows the protagonist as opposed to being first person through the person's eyes. I get motion sick and I don't know if I'm motion sick, but if I watch somebody play it, I get motion sick. If I'm playing it, it just kind of bothers me and gives me a headache. Or eye strain, more likely. My gaming is pretty limited to old school looking stuff. Can you tell us what kind of PCs in terms of configuration and OS you were using during your work at Microsoft? Yeah, I can give you kind of a big picture snapshot. When I came in, I was in MS-DOS, and so everybody else generally had 386, and some people had 486s. The top machine at that point would be a 4666, but only probably people had those at home maybe, but they weren't buying those at work for compiling MS-DOS. My machine when I came in was a Pentium, which is, of course, is better than a 486. So I was like really stoked until I ran it. I'm like, it's not really any faster than the 386 25 that I've got over here as a test machine. And the reason is it was crippled in terms of CPU frequency to something like 16 megahertz. What they wanted to do was to make sure that the Pentium chip was fully compatible with everything we were making. So they would give us a couple of these test units to make sure that everything worked. But they were crippled in terms of clock rates, so you didn't get any performance gain out of it. When I finally got over to OLARPC, which was Windows NT, I believe I had made it all the way to 12 megabytes of memory. The standard was 8 megabytes of memory. And later I looked, the system requirement is 12. So it was not a stretch to say you needed 12 to run the thing. And that was a 38640, I believe, in that time. I don't know if that was the gateway box. No, the gateway box was the 33. Where there were a bunch of machines in that kind of 386, 40, 46, 25 range. That went on for a long time. And then because I went into NT, I then started working on RISC. And part of the reason I wanted to work on RISC was then you got a RISC machine. And so I would get a MIPS dual processor, 200 megahertz. I think that's 100 megahertz on each core. Pretty loaded up with RAM for the time. Machine, and the cost was that you then got to do all the work of porting a bunch of stuff over to the MIPS, but that was kind of fun anyway. So that was really what I used for the next couple of years. When I finally went back to Windows PCs, I think I had an AMD Athlon in both that era, so I don't actually remember what I went back to, but my early days were pretty much 386, 46, Pentium. How do you feel about Task Manager flickering when resizing Explorer? What? I have to end the live stream. Sorry. I was not aware that it flickered. The only thing I've ever seen flicker in Task Manager was when they first added the networking page, they were not careful and they broke something so the networking page flickered as you did it. I'll play around later on my machine since I killed audio earlier just by clicking on things. I'm not going to risk anything right now. In what Windows XP build was the Build Lab system first introduced? The Build Lab actually predates Windows XP by quite a bit. The Build Lab goes back to before Windows NT 3.1. So it was as soon as there were enough people working on the team that you needed a daily build, they pretty much assigned a couple people to produce a daily build, and then it moved into an official lab and so on and so forth. So really there was always one. Why is my name not in the Windows 95 credits in the Explorer Easter egg? Yes. Well, there's two theories to this one. Theory number one, I was in OLARPC and then moved to Windows NT before they did the list for the Easter egg. So by the time they did the list, I was gone and working on NT. So I was no longer in the Win90X, whatever you want to call it, ecosystem anymore, or food chain. So I was out of there. So I did not make that list, even though I had worked and contributed and I got a Ship It award and stuff for Windows 95 because I had done OLARPC stuff. The other idea is that when the Easter egg, oh no, it actually can't be responsible for it because it antedates it. But I'll tell you the story anyway. So this is not why I'm not in there, but when I'm not an Easter egg fan, especially in operating systems. I just don't think they're appropriate. Anyway, so I get this email to, it's like NT Dev group with 1,000 some people on it. Here's the Windows Easter egg, try it out. And I'm kind of choked. I'm like, I just hate Easter eggs. So I'm like, it's got to be a way to crash this damn thing. And I think about it for a minute and I realize, well, I can't size it down to 0 in any dimension because I'm trying to get a divide by 0 error. It's probably the easiest way to crash anything. And I can't get anything to 0 dimension, but I've realized if I turn on the Explorer bar, now you can get the horizontal dimension of the right pane down to 0, and boom, the whole thing blew up right away. And this was 30 seconds after receiving the email. So like an idiot, I was a young man. I replied all to the email and said, by the way, if you size it down to 0, this crashes. And that was pretty much all I said. And I did a reply all to everyone. Not the classiest moment. That's one I'd like to have back. So sorry, Todd. That's when I got a Todd. I'm not going to say who it was, but it was Todd. And I want an apology to Todd. How did .NET and C# come to life at Microsoft? I don't really know, except I believe we did hire the guy that had been at Borland that did their languages, like Turbo Pascal. And when he came to Microsoft, C# and the .NET runtime was largely a production of his appearance. That's my understanding. I don't know that that's entirely true. Why is the Unix Epoch set to 1970 instead of 1900? Well, you'd have to ask like my grandpa. But no, actually, I was born before 1970, so I should be careful what I say. The only reason I can think of is to give themselves more headroom. If they would have set it all the way back to 1900, then, and this is that date is only used for elapsed times from boot time forward. So really, if you never anticipate booting the system with a date before 1970, and Unix is only so old, even though it's old, then you're fine capping it at 1970, and there's really no benefit to going back further, but there is a cost to going back further in that the headroom in the number and how far it can reach forward is then limited. So better to be as far forward as you can. What did Microsoft use before Direct3D or OpenGL? Well, I ported Pinball from Win9X to Windows NT, as you may know, and that was using WinG or Create Dib section, and those may be the same thing. But I'm pretty sure it was Create Dib section. So what it was you were able to create a region of memory that was effectively shared between the video card and the process, or it was shared in a way, to simplify it, that you could push large blocks of memory out to the video card efficiently. And that was really the first ability to almost act as a blitter chip with the video card under Windows NT. And so once they had that, you were able to draw larger blocks fairly efficiently, large sprites and all of that. So it was before Direct3D and DirectX. Once those came out, they, of course, supplanted and replaced that. But for that era, that was the only way you could really write a game, and that's how Pinball was written. Did you have anything to do with Flight Simulator? No, a good friend of mine went over there to work over there for a year or so, though. But what did you think of the removal of the Start menu in Windows 8? I was not a fan of Windows 8 and the approach that they adopted to trying to make it a tablet operating system at the cost of not making it a desktop operating system anymore, is kind of how I felt about it. And so, yeah, I was not a fan of having removed the Start menu. Why does the Control-Delete screen in NT remain at the previous resolution if you change it? Well, that could be a bug, but it actually probably stems more from the fact that your desktop is separate from the desktop, the secure action sequence desktop. So it comes up and it uses probably whatever resolution your desktop is using. But if you change your resolution, it doesn't have to go and change the resolution of the secure action sequence desktop. That's my guess, but that does have the cost of now every time you press Control-Delete or you get kicked over to that screen, it's going to do a resolution change. So you could argue it's a bug, but you could also have two desktops running with different resolutions, or two window stations with different resolutions. So what do you do in that case? So the resolution is technically independent. Would you port Pinball again for mobile if you'd be allowed to do so? Yeah, that'd actually be a kind of a fun project, I think. I would probably just do it in Unity or something like that. Do you know who came up with the idea of the Windows registry? No, I don't actually know who came up with it. I think If you remember my, not the interns episode, the dude living in the shack episode, John Wirth, I believe, was responsible for what we called hives. And that is what the registry is. So it's a database, of course, of some kind, tree-style database. I don't know how I feel about it. In some ways, for configuring operating system stuff, I'm okay with any files. So Unix gets by, right? And in other ways, you don't want to have to scrape an entire file system when you're moving around user stuff. So I can see an argument for both. You shouldn't be placing large data in there, and it really is, I think, best for stuff that roams. So if it roams from machine to machine, then it makes sense for me for it to be in its own little database, independent of a bunch of any files scattered all over the world. Did you write some lines of Windows MS-DOS in x86 assembly? Yes, everything I did in MS-DOS, I think, was entirely in x86 assembly. Was it 8086? Yeah, actually it was, because you couldn't assume 8286 or even 8186, so everything was just 8086. Do you consider Windows security inferior to Linux? I'm working on a video right now, which is sort of a Windows versus Linux round one, open source versus proprietary. And one of the topics in there is, how does open source contribute to the security of the operating system, and which is better, open source or proprietary? The argument I wind up making in this case, and you'll have to tune into the episode, of course, to find out who wins the entire episode with round one. But the argument I make is that it's much easier to find and therefore exploit bugs in an operating system when you have access to the source code. By the same token, they will eventually get fixed if the right people see them. But there's a huge gap there in between when you release the source code, while the black hats and the white hats are both searching for them at the same time, and they're found in random non-deterministic order. So if the black hats find them first, it would have been better that it was proprietary and not found whatsoever in those cases. So I think you can make a pretty strong argument that proprietary software is tighter in terms of security because it's harder to find exploits. However, that said, it's a much larger target. Just by the nature of Windows and the market, everybody wants to break into Windows. So that makes it that much bigger of a target and that much more likely that you're going to get an exploit. That probably at the end of the day makes Windows less secure than Linux, just because it's such an attractive target that that's where people focus all their energies. The other issue is sort of historical, and that's the fact that people run as administrator. Now, they've done kind of an admirable job, I think, with UAC and running you in restricted privilege mode for a while until you escalate. But the problem, I think, is I'm going to blame the apps, because what happens is apps so frequently say, I need to be administrator. They don't even know why they need to be administrator. They just didn't work right if they weren't careful. They didn't ask for the right permission at the same point that they did have. And as a result, everybody runs as administrator, and it causes a lot of security problems that you just don't have on Unix, because you can escalate using the sudo command and otherwise run at low privilege all the time and escalate only when you are occasionally prompted for your password in some cases by batch files and stuff, but by and large, you know what's going on. And if you're asked for your password, you stop and think, at least on a Linux system. On a Windows system, when you get the UAC prompt, it's pretty tough to not make that a reflexive at some point. You kind of have a trust feeling for how sensitive you are about the vendor of the software that you're using. If some shenanigans shareware pops up, I need to be admin right away, I think about it a little longer than if Office installation needs to be administrator. And this is not just a problem with Windows, because it also happens on the Macintosh, where you get that same prompt, and after a while, it's pretty easy to just reflexively start clicking OK on it. So because of that, under Unix, you are much more selective about when and how you run as an administrator, and therefore the number of exploits that can actually get installed is just smaller as a result. Gotta pour myself some coffee. Hang on, please. Hey, I didn't even scald myself yet. I didn't even make a mess. Why do I do that when nobody's watching? Oh, wait. But you couldn't see. Why is it possible to write to the bitmap sector through the Explorer bar? Are you saying that you can type something into the Explorer bar of the browser that will write to the hard drive's sector 0? I'd like to see that. Otherwise, I'm not sure what you're actually referring to. Earlier there was a question about build labs, and I misunderstood it. The question was actually intended to be about virtual build labs, which I know nothing about because they happened after me. Sorry. Windows 10S mode. Don't know what that is either. You'd think, see, I'm not like a Windows fanboy where I'm chomping at the bit to know every latest Windows feature. I just use it for what I use it for. And so I don't often know what's going on. I don't even know what S mode is. So I apologize for that one. That's why I'm more on the history side and less on the current support side. Can you talk about what your Ole com work did? What general problems did it solve? Yeah, actually, I can give you a brief summary of that. So what I was working on is called the Ole presentation cache. And what it is you can imagine if you have a Word document with an Excel chart and graph in it, every time you scroll by or every time it has to render the chart, you don't want to have to load Excel and call across some COM interface and say, please render me this chart. That would be hugely expensive. It would work, but the amount of memory demands and even CPU would be enormous. So what they do is they let you draw it the first time. They say, here's a device context. Please render into it. And I will basically record whatever it is that you do so that when I have to play it back, I will just play back a meta file, which represents all the drawing commands that you did. And so I was working on that and specifically on the enhanced meta file format for it so that you could provide an enhanced meta file, which was a rendering of what your object should look like when it's in place in somebody else's document. And then all the operating system does is replay that meta file. Now, you can also do it with a bitmap, and you can do it with most other text formats, with most other clipboard formats. So you can do it with simple text even, things like that. Hey, I bet you that's really loud if I slurp and swallow my coffee right by the microphone. What is it about programming that you like? Is it the feeling of success when it works or the challenge in finding an algorithm? There was somebody was telling a story on the Microsoft Old Timers group. And basically, if I remember correctly, what it was is he was teaching his kid to write in Python or something. And I don't know if it was for school or no, it was just for some hobby that the kid was working on. And he probably was gaming and wanted to do something related to the game and needed to do some code to drive a bot or who knows, something like that. And the dad kind of walks by the kid's room and the kid's like, Dad, come on in. And he's trying to show him, it's so cool. I read this and look, it did exactly what I wanted. And the father's like, son, it doesn't matter how long you've been coding. That feeling never goes away. And that's why I code. And kind of proud of himself as dad, he walks out of the room. 10 minutes later, he walks by the kid's room again and he hears, son of a, why doesn't it work? And he hears all this yelling. And the father says, and that feeling also never goes away, which is largely true. So you really do run the emotional gamut of highs and lows when you're coding. And, you can even get desperation after you've been looking at some kind of bug that's important to you that shouldn't not work. And it's been 2 days or how did it ever work? There's lots of scenarios where bugs can just become something that you can obsess over trying to fix. So somebody else was asking me about OCD and whether or not I had thought that I developed OCD as a result of being a programmer and worrying about bugs and so on and so forth. Now, to be clear, I don't have OCD. I just have OC probably because I don't have a disorder. And it bugs me when people say, I've got a little bit of OCD. No, you can't have a little bit of a disorder. You either have a disorder or you just have a little bit of compulsive behavior. And like them, I just have a little bit of compulsive behavior, I think, where once I get focused on a problem, I absolutely positively need to solve that problem before I can move on. And it will haunt me and I will obsess over it until I do. And this is a good trait when you're a programmer for many reasons, less so in other areas of your life. But how much ASM still exists within Windows? Very, very little, just the hardware abstraction layer, because everything else has to be per CPU. So let's say, and this is a case that was true, the pinball game, all the sound code was written in assembly. And when they just brought it over to the Windows Plus pack, that's fine because it was obviously still x86, it'll run. But I was running it on the MIPS, Alpha PowerPC, and the other chips. So I had to rewrite all that code in native C and just have it do the same thing that the assembly version was doing. So there's no way you would have to write literally 4 or 5 versions of that same assembly in order to be able to check assembly into the system. The one exception that I can think of that is Dave C. wrote some super fast, hyper optimized console scrolling code and checked that in for the MIPS. So as far as I remember, all the other platforms, because DOS has, I don't want to get too far out of my lane here and tell you how video chips work, but I believe the IBM video chip that's in CGA and EGA and all the stuff that's basically emulated in a console, there is a character mode that the chips support, whereas on the MIPS, everything was bitmapped, and so it was really slow if you scrolled text. So he checked in some assembly language that would quickly scroll bitmap console windows. It wasn't needed at that level of optimization for the other platforms, and therefore remained in C for everything except the MIPS. But that's like the only exception I can think of. Have I tried iOS development with Xcode on your Mac? I have tried a tiny amount of Objective-C when that was still cool and did not like it. I don't know anything about Swift yet. I have written iOS apps and games, but I did it all in Unity, which is nice because not only do you not have to learn the Mac then, but it works pretty much everywhere you want to target it. Could you do live stream on some of the other topics you have on YouTube other than Microsoft? I could. I would just love to answer questions you have about them outside of the confines of the Microsoft topic. If you fire them in here, I'll answer them. If Glenn passes them along, if there's sufficiently sounding cool or interesting. Any programming language you really like? Well, as I mentioned, I'm a pretty big fan of C#, but a language that I really was a fan of when I was younger, but I've had no opportunity to play with was Ada. There was so much that you could specify in the language. Like if you had an array and the array index started at 11 and went up to 27, you could say that this is an array that goes from index 11 to 27. In C or any other language, you're going to have to really offset that by having an offset index of 11, and then you're going to have 16 elements or whatever the delta there is. And there's areas for bugs. So the language eliminates a set of bugs and a number of classes of bugs. It's kind of one of those languages where if it compiles, it's probably going to work. So I've always wanted to play with it. Tell me anything about the screensavers, WinNT, the XP screensavers, pipes or maze. They were fun. Yeah, who wrote those? It's either like Michael Fortier or not Andre Vachon, but they're all French-sounding names for some reason. That's probably why I'm confusing them, but I think it was one of those guys, and I'm probably way wrong. I was trying to get the pipe screensaver running, and long story short, there's no easy way. I found the easiest way was to to just play full screen the YouTube video of 3 hours of pipe screensaver. I got my fill. Do you still have the Corvette you bought after you bought or sold the rights to ZIPFolders? No, that was a 1994. And it ran a 11.6 straight out of the box at the racetrack here, which was actually really fast. No, wait, did not. It ran a 1365. Sorry about that, people. My memory was a little confused there. No, it ran a 1365 straight out of the box down at SIR, which was actually still very fast for an LT1 Corvette in the day. They were for an automatic car, which this one actually was. Long story. They were more like a 14-second car, but this one, for some reason, just was a little quicker. And then I put a supercharger on it, which got it down to 11.9. Then I decided to pull the motor out, build a complete stroker motor with all hardened forged parts, blew it out to 396 cubic inches from 350 by taking the rods out to 3875 and the bore to 4060, I think. I'd have to look those numbers up. I'm pulling those numbers out of my butt. But long story short, I put a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of love, a lot of effort into this motor, put it all back together, strapped the supercharger on, headed back to the track, ran 11.9, exactly the same time that I had with the old factory motor. So I was a little disheartened. After that, I drove it for a while and then traded it in on a yellow C6 Corvette, the Z06 with the 6-speed transmission, and drove that for a number of years until the new supercharged 650 horsepower cars came out, and then I realized I absolutely needed one of those. So that's what I currently have. The rear wheel drive, and it's a convertible, but it's red, so it looks kind of like the ZIPFolders Corvette. The new one, the C8, is obviously probably technically a much better car, but the C7 with the supercharged 650 torque motor, rear wheel drive, unmanageable amounts of power is really just the obscene extrapolation of everything I loved about cars as a kid. Take it to the max, whatever the correct way to say that is. And so I like it. It's not the best car. It's not a Huracan. It's not even a new Corvette. It's nothing fancy, but it is, like I said, it's an extremely fast, scary, and powerful version of the long hood, short deck, big motor, scary sounds. And even though my wife's Tesla is way faster. Are you a racing fan too? What else are you passionate about apart from tech? Well, I watch a lot of NFL when it's in season, but I don't watch any other sports for some reason. I do enjoy racing, and I've taken my family and my wife and kids to the track here where we did the day of lapping. And I think that was great for everybody because they also did like wet skid pad and wet ABS braking, which was my son's first real opportunity to do full lockup, steer around cones under ABS braking. I think that's something everybody should get the opportunity to do so you know how to do it in a car. So I've done lapping there. My brother and I went out to, what's it called? Not Spring. Is it Spring Mountain? Maybe it is Spring Mountain. Anyway, it's down outside of Las Vegas, and it's where they have the driving school for the Corvettes. And if you buy a Corvette, you get a discount on the driving school. And we went and spent the weekend there, and it was an incredible amount of fun. You get a real appreciation really quickly for what the cars are capable of, which is an enormous amount beyond what you would ever use it for on the street. So it's a real eye-opening experience. And I think my wife's favorite story is at SIR, the track here. What happens is the drag strip is the straightaway, basically. So you come up onto it maybe at 40 miles an hour. Then by the end of the straight, depending on the car, in the Corvette, I'm doing something like 160, 165. She was driving the M3, which is a little bit slower car. But basically, you have to rotate the car and point it directly at the wall because you're going to drift sideways as you go around it. But pointing your car at a wall at 100 miles an hour or 100 some miles an hour, it's got a certain pucker factor, and it is very unnatural to do. But as the instructor told her, if you don't do this, you will die. So you learn to do it quickly. So that's something I enjoy doing. But what has been your favorite car and would you like to own in the future? My favorite car by far is currently my 2018 Mercedes S63 Coupe. And I just say coupe to bother one of my sons, but it's the two-door version because that's the body style I like, and you don't see many of them. And 621 horsepower, all-wheel drive. And it's a lot of fun, and it has probably the best interior that I have seen in person. I've seen a couple photos of a Bentley that look pretty nice, but in terms of the interior, it's really nice. And that's where you spend your time, right? So it's like if you're going to spend money, spend it on a mattress that you lay down on for half your life. And if you commute or drive a lot, then spend time on your car interior because that's what you're going to be looking at for a lot of your day. So I very much love that car. The only thing I don't really like about it is the MCT transmission, which is it's a hydraulic clutch pack in place of a torque converter, and the computer regulates the slip of it to simulate being a torque converter. But it's not really a great simulation. Once you're rolling and once you're out of first gear and even into third gear, then it's incredibly smooth and it's great. And it shifts like lightning. But it's kind of more like a DCT down low. So they haven't really got to the point where they've simulated an automatic transmission, but they've done a good job of taming a DCT, even though it's an MCT, which is a hybrid of automatic and DCT transmissions, as I understand it. We're past the hour, but I'm just going to keep on rolling here as long as there's some interesting questions. Lots of developers don't like JavaScript. Have you written any JavaScript code? What's your opinion of JavaScript? I don't like JavaScript. Yeah, actually, it's not JavaScript that I dislike per se, although I'm not a fan of typeless languages because I like the compiler to help me and not hide things or not ignore things for me. Yeah, have I written any JS code? Yeah, I've written a lot of JS code in my life. I just don't like doing it. And that is also a function of the development environment. If I was writing an app end to end and I was all on the client side and you had a good IDE and breakpoints and everything that you wanted in a normal language, then JavaScript is not that bad. And you can do that with Visual Studio Code. The problem is so much of it is putting stuff together, shipping data off to the server, waiting for a packet to come back, handling asynchronous and promises and nonsense, and none of it's fun. So it's kind of one of those necessary evil things. Dave, how do you feel about enthusiasts who unearth leaked beta builds of Windows to play around with? Well, it's none of my business, but I'm not going to encourage you to do anything wrong or illegal or immoral or against a contract that you've signed, but have at it. That's what I figure. I mean, as long as you're not leaking it further or doing any damage, you might as well have a look. What was the most bug-free code you ever wrote at Microsoft? Probably Task Manager, I would guess. Or, probably some of the really core important parts of WPA that really had to not crash. Hi, Dave. How did you start programming? At the risk of repeating, because I think I have mentioned this at least in one video, but I get this question a lot. So for a while, I'm going to keep answering it as long as it comes up. I started programming by wandering into a Radio Shack store and, longer story short, setting up the computer for them and then playing around with the basic interpreter. I thought it understood English, and I thought SN question mark, which is its error, meant spelling error. So I eventually figured out what words it would handle and which ones it didn't, and assigning variables. It was really like hit and miss, but I'd ride my bike down there every Thursday because we had late night shopping, and I'd spend my 3 hours there. I didn't save anything for months because there was nothing really worth saving, but eventually I must have found a book on BASIC and figured out that there were actually keywords and how to code in BASIC, because I have since found stuff in like 5th and 6th grade where I've written out on Foolscap my little basic programs, that kind of thing. I remember writing a character generator for D&D, and I sent it to Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, I think Arneson at whatever company at the time owned the license to D&D. And one of them, and I think it was Arneson, wrote back to me and had little corrections in my program and suggestions. And that was really cool because I was something like 10 or 12 years old, and I didn't really expect to hear back, but to get that kind of encouragement from a random stranger was actually pretty cool. So that's some of my earliest programming. And then I got a Commodore 64, went from there. That was assembly language eventually, and then to C on the Amiga. I've heard many professors talk about the complexity of the underlying software. Do you have any experience in car source code? Yes. The first thing I ever did was there was a bug in the aforementioned Corvette. So once I put the supercharger on it and I got to the track, it would not upshift from first to second gear when you had a really good first gear. So if it really hooked and it really pulled hard, it would bang the rev limiter and not shift. And I would keep moving the shift point down in the computer, but it didn't help. It would just hang the gear and not shift. Long story short, I found a bug in the code in assembly language by reading and disassembling their code with IDA Pro, where it has a speed sensor. And if the delta in that speed sensor is unreasonable, which to them is faster than a Corvette could ever be, it puts the transmission into limp mode, which does not automatically shift. You have to manually bang shift it. So that I was pretty proud of that, and I think it was a really easy fix. It was like a 1-byte fix to no op out a branch or something, so that it didn't do that anymore. And that was it. But I have done some stuff on my Range Rover. I have integrated with the CANBUS on my M3 as well. I just took it in and I noticed there was a wiring harness laying in the trunk. So I'm like, ooh, gotta put that away. What was I doing on the M3? Oh, I was playing with code so that if I went up and I hit the unlock button 3 times, it would lower the top. And if I hit the lock button 3 times, it would raise the top. I got it working, but it wasn't really reliable enough. And then the board kind of fell off in the trunk. And I was really more interested in seeing if I could do it than actually making a product out of it. And I was able to do it. So that's where I left it. Did you work with Jim Kelly or Lou Perizoli? Yes, both. I worked for... Did I work for Lou indirectly? Yes, I did, actually, because I worked for Leif Peterson, and Leif Peterson worked for Lou P. So, is the source code in Windows really well written, or is there a lot of duct tape and baling wire buried in there? It depends on what part you're talking about. If you're talking about the heap manager, it's elegant, it's golden, it's beautiful. If you're talking about important parts of the kernel and stuff like that, it's really nice code. It really is. Now, if you're talking about code that maybe somebody banged out in order to fix an edge case in the shell, because when you do this and you hold down control, then something weird happens. If there's some weird case like that, some of that code can get a little meh. There was also a code that I would say came over from other teams that needed to be spruced up a little more than maybe it was before it got checked into the product. But I mean, that's a long time ago. So I assume any of that stuff has been tidied up. There's also tools like, what's it called? Polycheck. Basically, they scan now for things in comments you shouldn't be putting, like profanity and the word, this would explode. Do you do all your private projects nowadays under Windows, or do you use any other OS? Would you consider becoming a contributor to the Linux kernel? Well, Lemon tells you I was a contributor to the Linux kernel back in 1992, so they call me Grandpa. No, actually, I did. I fixed some, it was a handle leaks or memory leaks. Whatever build I had installed, I found some leaks, and I sent email to Linus at Rutgers, and that's really all I remember. And I just gave them my diffs. No idea if they ever made it into the code or not, so I'll tell everybody that they did, because then I'm a contributor to Linux, Windows, and Apple, and therefore you can't escape me. Well, Apple only if you're running Office, because then you have COM and OLE. But do you do all your private projects nowadays under Windows? No, actually. For the last couple of years, I was not on Windows at all. I was entirely on the Mac for desktop work out in the shop here, using for video and editing and so on. And because I had a Mac in the shop, which was where I was doing electronics projects, that's all I was largely doing. And so I was using the Mac pretty much exclusively. I then, because I realized, hey, this code I'm using .NET Core is supposed to run on Linux and Windows, I then ported it to Linux, got it working on Linux, ran it on the Pi. Then I ported it to my Synology NAS, and it now runs on my NAS box because it never gets interrupted. It's on a UPS. And so my LEDs are controlled by the NAS box, which basically runs by Christmas lights. So it runs on all three platforms, actually. Now do I run that on Windows? What do I run on Windows? No, I run the server side. Yes, the .NET Core part. I run the server side on Windows right now because that machine's on a UPS and gets rebooted less than the Mac. So pretty much I'll use anything. I don't really want to learn Swift. I don't want to learn stuff that's specific to Mac OS. I would prefer not to learn a whole bunch of stuff that's really specific to Linux itself, but there's not much that is. So except for kernel stuff, and I don't really need to know a huge ton of that. So especially if it can be general in terms of what I'm learning, then I'm really happy. Can you talk about the Windows path limitation to 260 characters? Yeah, I believe that came out of, is it an MS-DOS limitation? And it's probably the file system limitation. And realistically, I worked on the Amiga, and it did not have path lengths. So path could be any length or any reasonable length, I think. And dealing with it as an application programmer is way more complicated, because everything you do, you have to call and allocate and ask, how many bytes do I need? Okay, now I allocate that much memory. Now do my work and then free it. Whereas with MaxPath, you can just have a buffer on a stack, and it's literally like an instruction, because it's just going to move EBP or something and allocate more stack space for that variable. So it's way more efficient too, and probably makes the system a lot faster. So there's huge benefits to MaxPath, and very rarely have I ever been burned by MaxPath. I have been burned by MaxPath, but not that frequently. So if you're going to make your own OS company, what would you do different than what Microsoft does or did? Well, I did have my own company, and it never got bigger than about 35 people. But what we did is we had one big central iron server called Minerva, and everybody ran terminal server into that. So I just kept adding memory and hardware to that singular box as the company grew. Now, eventually you get to the point where the single core performance, or even the multi-core performance for people, can be locked up. Get one person hogging CPU and that kind of thing, and you get 31 other unhappy people. But as long as you're careful about that kind of thing, it was a centralized type of administration where I only really had to worry about one box, and then the other 30 boxes were basically disposable. So in terms of running a company and doing support for a large number, not large, like 36 machines, I really like that approach. And it was small enough that I was able to do, tech support for my own company. So of all the changes in Windows, has there been a change that made you do a facepalm and wonder why? Just Windows 8. Maybe some other small stuff, but yeah, Windows 8 I did not get. How did you get the code off the car in order to decompile it? So back then, I don't remember what it's called, but there is the ALDL port, the assembly line diagnostics link. There's a port underneath the dashboard, and there's like a J1354 interface. You plug into that, and with the right software, which I bought from a company, you can pull the ROM image out and then look at the ROM image, edit it, change it, and flash it back. So If you could take the best features of Windows NT like and Unix-like systems and create the best system ever, what would it be like? It'd be like exactly like the video I'm releasing tomorrow on the world's ultimate hybrid desktop system. Windows as the UI and Linux distributions as your kernel and your command lines. So something like that. I found it interesting. Do you think there's still code that BillG wrote in Windows or anything that is, well, no, there is not. BillG has not written code since the TRS-80 Model 100, which was that portable calculator. And I could be mistaken on this, but I think the last thing that he actually wrote for a desktop was Donkey.Bass, the game that came in MS-DOS, where you had a car that drove down a road and a donkey would appear and you got to toggle which lane you were in. I'm told he wrote that. So nothing in Windows and nothing in NT and nothing in MS-DOS. What am I learning? Right now I'm learning React, trying to write a UI or be prepared to write a UI for my server so that I can go in and actually control it and edit it and change LED parameters and so on without having to edit tables, which is kind of how I'm doing it now. Are there any instances of dead beef? Okay, so dead beef is a 32-bit value, DEADBEEF, dead beef. And it spells out a word so you can see that in the debugger, oh man, it's dead beef. And so if you use that as a value to initialize a block of memory, then it's easy to spot whether it's been overwritten or not later. You can also use bad food and some others. What is the most nostalgic feature of Windows that makes you go back in time apart from Task Manager? Probably the format, because it's changed so little. I mean, it still looks like the morning I wrote the thing. So talk a bit about the team development process. In past videos, you mentioned that it might take 2 days to compile Windows. By what machines was it compiled? What compiler was used? And how about today? So I'll give you just kind of a basic overview of what the dev cycle was like. We checked code out of a machine, which was basically just a UNC share. It was not a database server. It wasn't a source code control server by any stretch. It was just a server hosting files. And we used a program called Slime, slm.exe, which was the source library manager, which was our source control code to pull code out of that. And all of it was done on the client. So there was nothing going on the server other than being a dumb server. From there, you would only keep out the portion of the code that you needed to build. So I would just probably keep out NT private shell and there down. Somebody else might keep out NT private user or NT private GDI, those kinds of projects, and only build from there on down. And so those are things you could build in maybe an hour or two. If you were working on a smaller portion and you didn't touch a header file, of course, then it's pretty quick. You could relink in a minute or two. But if you actually touched a header file and had to rebuild the entire shell, that in those days could take a long time. It's not that you had to build the entire source code tree, because you didn't, and very few people ever did. The only reason that I ever did was because I was lazy and I wanted to use the VC debugger, which meant that I wanted PDB symbols. Well, the Build Lab was not interested in producing PDB symbols because A, they're huge, and B, nobody uses them. Everybody's manly and uses NTSD and i386KD, which are the two debuggers. NTSD being the user mode side, and i386KD, or varies by processor, being the kernel debugger. So you would debug your code using those two debuggers normally. I wanted to use VC, so I was building much of the thing with my own symbols, and that was fine for shell. But if I had to wander out of the shell too far and I wanted to do source level debugging, then you would have to build either the entire tree or whatever section of the tree that you cared about. By and large, I mean, you still had to know NTSD and the debugger and be proficient in it, because in the morning you would come in and there would be stress failures. What happens is every night your machine, your dev machine, is used as a terminal, and your test machine runs a batch file basically that pulls down 100 things to run, and it runs them all at once. And so you can imagine maybe it's creating databases and running Pinball and doing all kinds of stuff. And it's trying to crash itself basically. If it does, it falls into the debugger on your dev machine, which anybody can connect to and debug the test machine. So in the morning you come in and say, look, you own this component. The debugger is crashed and hung in this component because the triage team came in early and figured out where the stack was, and you own it, so you get assigned this bug. Please fix it. So that would be some of your early morning if you had stress failures. Then you would work on your own code. When you had something to check in, you would build everything locally, and once you had your binaries linking, you could then check in as soon as you were sure that you had built everything that was impacted by your change. And you had to be careful, because if you changed the header like shell.h, it's a shell.h, well, the shell header file anyway, whatever it's called, that's probably consumed widely throughout the product. So you probably either need to build the whole thing or have the build lab build it for you, or find out for sure that your change is non-breaking, because you can't check in a breaking change and then just later say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't build that part. So, my machine's not powerful enough. I need a new machine. That's that kind of whininess. Once you were checked in, the build lab would sync your change and build it. Then once per night, they would sync everybody's changes, and they would do a clean build of the entire world, and of the entire world being the NT source kit base. That's when a lot of things broke, that only broke because you're doing a clean build, and now it notices the dependency that you got away with when you were in the midday and didn't do a clean build, because it was like a side project that linked in the header from above. So that was generally the process. And then the build lab would produce a build that would come out in the morning, and it would have a build number, and it would be on a share, and you would come in and probably upgrade your test machine to that new daily build. You wouldn't upgrade your dev machine probably more than once every week or so until a good stable build came out. And it really depended on the quality of the daily builds. If they were good builds, I'd upgrade it every day, or fire it off at lunch, that kind of thing. But if the builds were a little more sketchy, then you might stay on a build for a week or so. But it was important to be running current dog food builds as well, because we had to find our own problems. There were test teams and test engineers, but you actually find a lot of stuff just by using the product. Why does NT4, 2K, XP, 2K3 secretly spawn a hidden window just before the login screen comes up? Closing it kills Control-Alt-Delete and Control-Alt-Escape. No. Control-Alt-Escape, possibly. But you can't kill Control-Alt-Delete, because that's a secure action sequence, and it's always hooked. It will always go somewhere. Control-Shift-Escape. The only thing I can think of, and this is just a guess, but I'm going to guess that for Task Manager to say, or for the shell to say, start Task Manager right now, please, that's to send a window message to the WinLogon process. But the WinLogon process needs to have a window to receive messages. So odds are it's creating a window which is hidden, and then receives messages like WM secret message to start Task Manager right now because I pressed Control-Shift-Escape message. So if you kill that window, there's now no target for that message, and therefore it cannot start. Total swag, but that's my guess. Were you running checked or free builds at home and at work? Free builds are basically what you would run as a retail product. No asserts, no symbols. The symbols are in a separate file. Whereas checked builds have all the symbols, they have all the asserts, they have the extra code paths, they have the extra testing, whatever is built in to a debug build. So checked builds are basically debug builds. And generally, I would never run a check build on my dev machine unless I was trying to catch some weird case. You will occasionally run a check build on the test machine because it's so much more thorough. It should make it through stress without an assertion, but it's hard to get a checked build machine through stress without an assertion. So what's the difference between zip files and Windows cabinet files? Cabinet files are a completely proprietary compression mechanism that I believe they bought from another company, and it has a better compression ratio than zip. And what they do is they combine the cabinet file format with a DMF, a distribution media format, which uses extra space on a floppy disk and gets like 1.68 megs of space on a 1.44 meg floppy, plus the extra compression from the cab format allows them to get that much more data onto a distribution floppy. What's your view on Linux desktop versus Windows? Are the desktop distributions ready to compete with Windows? Not in my opinion. Mint is pretty, and I kind of like looking at it, but I don't wind up running any of the desktop interfaces. I just wind up command line 20.04 LTS. Ubuntu server is what I've been running everywhere. As you'll see in the video that comes out tomorrow, I'm running Windows as the shell, and then I run consoles for all my distros. So I'm not actually running any UI on Linux right now at all. I do in a VM when I'm running it under Hyper-V. I run the Ubuntu. I don't know whatever the default is. I wish I knew what the heck it was. I'd tell you, but I don't. Why is it impossible to create a folder named con in Windows? Because Tom Scott is pompous. No, I'm kidding. He's wonderful. Because that is a reserved word going back to MS-DOS 1.0. PRT being print, con being console. So whenever it sees that name, it overrides all other logic and says, that's not a file name. You mean the console. And so if you type copy star to con, it will actually copy all the files out to the console and make a mess in your console. So because that's a reserved word, effectively, you can't name a file con either. Have I read the Windows Kernel Dev Rant? I don't know which one that is. If it is the why is the boot screen so ugly? Classic. I can't talk about it though. Not without permission from the people involved anyway, but came in one morning and there was quite an email trail. Why does Microsoft still include a pretty crappy text editor like Notepad? Here's one thing you may not know about Notepad. It is really, really tiny. Here's what Notepad is. It is a window, an edit control, a menu resource. That's pretty much it. I mean, there's some code there that if code equals IDM exit, then exit process and stuff like that, or save your file or whatever. But probably the reason Notepad is so super basic is that there's no program there. It's literally just a control wrapped in a window with a menu resource. Did you ever read the Mini Microsoft blog? I did not, because that was after my time, but I know it was much loved by the people that did read it in his day. Seeing as you mentioned Tom Scott, do you watch his videos? Yes, I do. I wish I could do everything in one take with an adorable accent, but I cannot. But I do enjoy his videos. Does the data mining by Facebook and Google and loss of internet privacy concern in any way? And do you try to protect yourself in any way? It doesn't concern me because I take it as a given, I guess. I assume that anything I do on the internet is going to be logged and not looked at by a human, but it's going to at least contribute to the algorithm that's going to decide what I'm going to see for advertisements and articles and content. So if you keep typing in stuff about bananas, you're going to get stuff about bananas back eventually. So if I don't want bananas to impact me, then I'm going to launch a VPN and I'm going to start a private browser session and then search for whatever product it is that I'm searching for that I don't want continually contributing to my source or to my search results. But that's really about it. Other than that, I assume that what I'm doing is going to be known to certain parties, and then I just act accordingly. Kind of like, do you think Alexa records you? Maybe. So I don't say things around Alexa that I'm not willing to have thrown in front of me in a court of law, that kind of thing. As a former employee, do you have a master key for unlimited seats for things like server and office? No, we get, well, sort of. We get a, if you join the alumni group, which is something like $100 or $200 a year, then you get access to something like 5 seats of office and a 1 terabyte OneDrive account. It kind of is a package deal. Then you get deals and other software, but lately or in the last couple of years, I haven't seen anything compelling. It used to be like, oh, I can go in and get Visual Studio for $50, but now the free version of Visual Studio is good enough. I have Office, so I'm pretty much set. It is worth it in the sense of getting those seats for Office for the price, so I do that every year. Why was the Alpha AXP Deck Alpha port of Windows 2000 canceled? I don't know if it was canceled before Windows 2000 came out, was it? That's possible. I don't know of any specific reason for the cancellation of any of the MEF platforms beyond user acceptance and market. So it was no more work for us at that point to well, it's a little more work, but it wasn't a huge amount of work to maintain it. Once you were doing the actual porting to Alpha is a lot of work, but keeping it that way is not. What is the most controversial Microsoft moment? Developers. Google it. Actually, search for it on YouTube. Developers. 3 words. Is the Windows UI built on top of the NT kernel or is it integral? Yes, it's entirely built on top of it. So the Explorer loads Shelf 32 DLL. Shelf 32 DLL talks to other DLLs like GDI DLL and User 32 DLL and so on. Those are either in the kernel or talk to the kernel, and that's how it gets its work done. What do you think about all the telemetry in Windows 10? I'm less concerned with the telemetry in Windows 10 than the fact that I can't set up a machine on Windows and just call myself Dave without setting up a Hotmail account and all the nonsense. And I've got to opt out like 4 different ways from Sunday. The out-of-box experience is terrible, and I feel like I'm being harvested every time I set one up. I also notice you have to scroll down and make sure that you can get the off-screen stuff to turn off advertising ID and that kind of nonsense, and that bothers me a certain amount. So I don't think they're doing anything nefarious. I assume they're collecting advertising data and harvesting it and then trying to find out what ads will best generate revenue when shown to you. And that's not a huge problem for me. But sometimes the Apple tax is worth it. And I'd rather have the option of paying a little more for Windows, maybe getting, I don't think there should be another SKU of Windows that's clean. That would be kind of weird. But some solution. I'm also okay with the telemetry of, hey, you start a task manager, because that's all done in aggregate and I don't have a problem with that. So the stuff that they use to report who does what with the operating system, what crashes, what works, what doesn't work, that kind of thing, that I'm all fine with. But the marketing side of it, it bugs me like it does you, I'm sure. Any thoughts on Elon Musk? Elon's mom is from my hometown. So there's a small bit of trivia for you. Regina, Saskatchewan. Elon is a fairly amazing dude. So there are a lot of questions I would like to ask him if he had spare time. Any interest in embedded programming, Dave? Well, I do a ton of Atmel and ESP32 programming now. So to that extent, yes. I didn't know what I was going to do when I was in college. I thought, I know I'm going to program, but I don't know what. Am I going to make the code that blinks the clock on a microwave? And then fortunately, I read this book on Microsoft, which kind of told me what I wanted to do with my life. But until then, I wasn't sure. It was like, am I going to do VCRs or embedded systems, or what the heck am I going to do? Is there a way to boot Windows so that it shows what it's doing like Linux does? Yes. It's either /SOS or /safe mode. And you might get then stuck in safe mode, but you will see everything, I believe, or at least you used to in the olden days, printed out as it gets loaded. What's the most controversial Microsoft moment? Probably some of the depositions with Bill. Or when some of the emails were probably read on the stand and they look really bad. Because things you say in an email like, hey, let's crush these dudes, man, don't look good when there's Ma and Pa and they're sitting in the witness stand and you're a billionaire and they're looking at you and they read your email back to them and it's like, let's crush those little competitors. So, yeah, it doesn't look good. So you never want your email read aloud. And that's another thing. Talking about, voicing opinions in front of Alexa, that's fine as long as you're willing to own up to them. And it's really the same deal with email. Anything you type in email, it's coming back to haunt you, man. What is something that once under NDA at Microsoft, but no longer, that once was under NDA at Microsoft, but no longer is on NDA that you'd like to share? I don't know, because I don't know what's public. I guess the only thing is that, well, the XP source code, arguably, I don't know if that's public or not, but you can certainly have a look at that, and that's come out in the meantime. What kind of music do you listen to? Do you have much interest in music? Yeah, I have a playlist called Shop with about 3,500 tracks that I listen to on random repeat in the shop. And then when that's done, I listen to classic rock or pop, whatever is on, and I will occasionally go, oh, add that to my playlist. So that's kind of how I do it. What's on there? Again, I'm not going to touch my machine, but probably a lot of 80s, 90s rock, tragically hip, and then modern stuff, but I never know who sings it because I only hear it while working out and stuff. So I'll just hear a song and be like, I know that song. That's from the gym. No idea who sings it. I get this question a lot too. Do you think it is possible for Microsoft to slowly change parts of the Windows NT kernel to make a hybrid with Linux kernel and then totally change so that Linux is a Linux kernel? Or is this just a madman's dream? Madman's dream, because here's why. And I explained this in the video that's coming out tomorrow. NT was originally architected to run separate subsystems in parallel on the same hardware. And now that we have a hypervisor where each of these subsystems can be written to talk basically to the raw hardware through the hypervisor, you have them running as full native raw operating systems as if they're running on bare metal, pretty much. while they're sitting on top, side by side on the machine. So you have the NT kernel and you have the Unix kernel, and they are side by side and they're peers of one another, and they are both running at full raw performance. So now why would you implement one in terms of the other? Why would I stick the Linux kernel under the NT kernel and then people ask me this, will they actually, put the Linux kernel in Windows and then start replacing the NT kernel with Linux kernel? I don't see that because it's an extra layer and it's just going to cause a performance degradation. So I think for things that need Linux or Docker's Linux environment, you write them and run them in the WSL environment. And for things that you want to run against Windows or the Docker for Windows, you run them in the Windows subsystem. And because of the way it's architected, with the hypervisor, it's really the best of both worlds. So, the I love sex Easter egg that was put into DOS. How was it tracked to the workstation next to you? That I don't know. I'm going to have the guy that called me about it on the show, so that'll be one of the questions I will ask him. What do you think of the XP source code leak, especially from a learning standpoint, to see how an OS was written? Well, it's not a leak to me because, I haven't seen the code in a long time, but I grew up with the code. So seeing it was not like a revelation. If anything, it'd be nostalgic to go back and look at code I wrote and the stuff I worked with. But having access to the actual source code for an API that you are calling and that is frustrating you for some reason and is returning a random error code is enormously valuable. So you can walk through the code, read through and go, oh, look, 2/3 of the way down, it returns bad banana. And now I know why, because these conditions have to be true for that to happen. And oh yeah, that is true if you look at my code. So that kind of thing makes debugging so much easier than just getting back an error code and hoping the documentation tells you something about it, which it probably doesn't. So having access and being able to see the source code, I would probably read that voraciously if I was a Windows developer. And if I was writing a Windows app, I would certainly be looking at the, if you're allowed to. Please don't run out and jeopardize your job by looking at the XP source code leak or something silly if you're not allowed to. But presuming that you are allowed to, and that it's legal and ethical to do so in your region and locale, then it would be a good idea to do so because you can learn a great deal from it. Dave, you've spoken out about autism. Can you please give some details why? Thank you. Well, you can assume I'm somewhere randomly on the spectrum. I don't want to get into a whole bunch of medical information and jargon while I'm here on a live stream with a whole bunch of people. But I know a fair bit about it, and I have a little experience with that sort of thing. So occasionally I will throw in a one-liner about, being wired that way or somewhere on the spectrum, that kind of thing. It's something I may spend more time on. I think it's a pretty relevant issue if you want to be a software developer in the industry. It was something that, certainly had an impact on me at Microsoft in a way that I wish I would have known more about it at the time. So that's kind of where I'm coming at it. Not something that it is something that I want to spend a lot of time talking about, but I think it could be valuable to people. So I may yet do that. So if it's something that's interesting, let me know in the comments. What happened to part 2 of the quad episode? Well, we filmed it, and what happened was we keep changing the quad. It's a little faster. It's got better throttle controller, and I keep thinking I could make a whole channel on the damn quad because we're always rewriting code for it. So I should just sit down with my son and do episode 2 of the quad. And the quad, by the way, is a 48-volt 4-wheel quad that my son and I built by taking an old 300-watt unit and upgrading it to a 2,000 watt and replacing the lead acid battery with lithium ion pack and so on and so forth. And it was way too fast. It was wickedly dangerous. And we spent a lot of time with code trying to slow the electronic speed controller down, that kind of thing. I should make the second episode, and I can't promise that I will, but it's on my to-do list. It's even officially on my list. So do you comment your code? Yes, I do. I comment my code when I'm really proud of it because I want to show off. And I comment my code when I want to explain to myself what it is that I'm doing because I think the code's not super clear, but I'm really happy with the way the code is. So as long as I explain what it's doing, and I don't mean like gross spaghetti code or nonsense or anything like that. I just mean these next 3 lines of code are pretty cool and they're pretty clever, but I don't want to change them. So I better explain what they're doing because it's not obvious when you first look. That's the kind of thing I comment. I don't put big blocks saying this is a function that prints out information that does this and that. I put in there what I'd like to read when I'm the guy debugging it. What? Why do you think Microsoft removed the calculator from WinT 20H2? They did? I used Stone Calculator. I did or it was on my team when we did the conversion to infinite precision math. And let me tell you, working on a calculator, that takes some courage, because could you imagine if Microsoft shipped a calculator with a bug in it, some weird case? You imagine, I mean, it was bad enough when Intel got into trouble with their FDiv bug that it would just be a huge embarrassment to Microsoft to ship a calculator that didn't add numbers correctly. So when they went and we made the change to infinite precision, that's some pretty complicated code, and there are many opportunities in there for it to go wrong or bad. It did not, but why did volume licensing keys bypass product activation completely? I assume you're aware it would be exploited. Yes, but you did need the media. So you couldn't just go to the store or go to your buddy's house and copy his retail copy of Windows, take it home and type in a volume key. I made sure that didn't work, and that's stupid. But what did work is if you could get a copy of the volume media. So that's a large thing to do in the year 1999 to download 650 megabytes. You could be there a while, especially if you're doing it with a modem. Even DSL, that's going to take a while. And that's why we had the OEM BIOS.bin file in there, which is the Microsoft Bob image. Oops, I just told you what file it's in. Oops, now you know. Breaking news. That file is in there to act as digital ballast so that it's different on each SKU, so that the diff from volume to retail is at least 10 megabytes or 20 megabytes, so that it's hard to download a patch that will turn your retail disk into a volume disk. And that's what I was going for there. So if you want to download and use a stolen volume licensing key, you're going to at least need a volume licensing CD or a very clever patch of about 10 to 20 megabytes in size, which is still hard to push around. So there was some knowledge that the volume license would be exploited, and there was no real way around it because we had to have that. So short of, dongle or something. Have you ever seen code from someone else that has made you think, damn, that's clever, or what the hell were they thinking? Probably the most clever code I've ever seen is a way of doing absolute value in x86 assembly language. And I can't do it from memory. You do a convert word to D word, and then there's an XOR with itself, and there's a couple steps there. It's like 3 instructions, and it comes out and does ABS, and it's super fast. And I never would have come up with this. I don't know how they came up with it, but it's an interview question. I hear write ABS in assembly language, and of course, it's the optimal solution. And I did not get it offhand, but when I saw it, I was like, wow. While at Microsoft, how much did you interact with teams outside the OS? For an engineer who is interested in moving to the OS dev, how easy is it to transfer to a Windows team? Moving around is actually very easy. You just apply for an open posting, and they're listed internally and so on and so forth. So if I wanted to move over to Microsoft Office, I would just read their postings. I would look for stuff at the equivalent ladder level that I'm at, and I would send over and say, I want to apply for this job. You should talk to your boss and manager first to let them know that you're interviewing and that kind of thing. And there are some other general rules, but it's actually pretty easy. In terms of interacting with teams, we did a lot with Office, not a lot, but some, but very little, actually. Not much with apps at all. If you needed information from a team like GDI or User32, that kind of thing, but they were close enough to what we did, that you didn't feel weird going and asking them information, but did not spend a lot of time interacting with people in like far away buildings on different products, working on Microsoft dogs that needed support from NT and stuff like that. So yeah, not a lot of interaction with remote teams. Any plans for selling merchandise? Well, I'm trying to talk my kids into like selling mugs, because I don't want to be in the business of selling mugs, but people ask me about it all the time. So if you want a mug, maybe let me know in the comments and I'll tell them, yeah, people actually want a mug. What is your opinion on variable naming conventions? Camel case. I start with lowercase and then I upcase the first word and all subsequent words. And what do I do I sometimes use an underscore for class variable names. Did you use Hungarian notation at Microsoft? If so, how did you like it? I did, and I loved it if it was used incorrectly. Correctly, if I understand the way it's supposed to be used, you will just have the designation of what the pointer or what the variable is. So if it's a pointer to a string that's null terminated, it'll be PSZ. If it's an index of characters, it's ICH. When I do it, I tell you what the string is, PSZ fire escape. ICH buffer, whatever it is. And I'm okay with that, but I've had to debug a lot of word code, not a lot of word code, but the time that I did have to debug some word code, it was written in the Hungarian that's very compact without the part of the name that tells you what it is, or why it is, I should say. It tells you what. Oh yeah, I know that you're a pointer to a null terminated string. I just have no idea what kind of string and why. So there's this very abbreviated version of Hungarian that I didn't like, but I did like the hybrid version where the first part is the declaration of what this function or what this variable actually is, and then the name. So I enjoyed that. It's not really necessary or useful, I don't think, so much. Nowadays, with all the tools and IntelliSeq and IntelliChoice, IntelliType, IntelliText, IntelliSomething. Looking through the Tempest code, did you uncover anything about the gameplay that you didn't already know? Yes, I found a bug. And I wrote to the original author, who never responds to me, and he still did not respond to me. I found a bug wherein when a pulsar makes it all the way to the top of the rail on a Tempest tube, it sometimes turns into a flipper. And that's a bug in the code because he actually has an and instead of an or. So he's clearing a bit instead of setting a bit. And it's pretty clear in the code that if you and it can't ever do anything other than clear it. So pretty sure it's a bug, and it causes a pulsar to turn into a flipper. So that was one thing that I've always wondered. Oh, maybe there's a limitation on how many pulsars can be on the screen at one time, but no. How do you manage to keep track of what you can say and what not? There should still be a lot of stuff under NDA, and there is. So talking about the Spectrum stuff earlier, my brain works in such a way that it has attached to every piece of information that I have kind of a sense of where I got it from and how trustworthy it is. And so everything that I generally say, I know at the back of my mind that I've heard it somewhere. I've read it on the web, I've heard it externally. And generally, as long as I've heard it from a third-party source somewhere, I'm willing to say it. I just know what's interesting, what's not. So I'm not willing to say things that only I know and that I've never seen exposed publicly elsewhere. That's kind of how I work it. Do you use SQL Server and so on in your personal projects? No, I usually use, I use SQL Express or MySQL or SQL. Sorry, I don't know how to say it. I only read it in books. Do you recommend to get a C++, a C+ or A+ certification to get started? That I can't really tell you. I would say you should be able to pass whatever test is required for that certification. But whether that certification is valuable to you or not in terms of getting a job, that I don't know because it's past, it's newer than I've been in the market. So here's a kind of question that I can answer that I get a lot of. Why does Microsoft allow certain kernel bugs to exist for years? A NT set process information bug allowed for an unkillable process by subtly corrupting the kernel structure for the process. Well, I would have to see the code for that. Then I would have to look at it and know how NT set process information manages to corrupt the kernel side because there's no way it should be able to do that. And then I would bug somebody to fix that because that sounds like nonsense. Now, sometimes there are cases where you have a bug in the product. And so there are times when you have bugs in the product that you have to keep for backwards compatibility. But I can't see that making a zombie process that you can't kill is something they would want to keep. So how would you get started working at the kernel and hardware level? I'd get a Pi and I would start hacking on the Linux kernel and I would do something interesting. I'd get a compute module 4 and I would try to get a RAID controller working and make the driver work. I mean, you're going to just troubleshoot for days and weeks, but you'll learn a ton. So here's something I was wondering, and maybe you can tell me if this is of any interest. I have written assembly language for a lot of my life, but it's kind of an outmoded thing right now. So there's two things that I thought might be interesting. One is to, even if I did it for the Commodore PET or a similar simple architecture, go through and here is a simple assembly language program to do a screensaver clock. And similarly, you could do, here's hello world for a Windows app that is actually still calling create window and not using any frameworks or structures, but actually doing it raw. So I don't know if there's any appetite for this retro programming, but if there is, let me know in the comments because it's something that I could actually do a fairly good job of producing, I think, because of the way that I have in the past done the mix of code and commentary. It's not something I get to do a lot because I don't have a lot of topics, But if I were to pick that up as a set of topics, it would be kind of fun to work on. But I don't know if there's any interest. Was there a large cultural difference between the Win95 OS teams and the NT kernel teams? Yeah, there really was. I mean, there was mutual respect and everything, but we kind of had that feeling that we didn't ever want it to crash. And they were more of the, if it crashes, we'll restart it, shut up, get on with things. And we got to make some money, and we got to be small and fast and light and different goals. So we were willing to say, look, pardon me, you need some more memory, but when you've got it, it's going to be more robust. Whereas Win95, they said, like, you're going to run an 8 megabytes or whatever. I actually don't remember what the hardware requirements were, but it's not going to be industrial strength robustness. We're not going to, and that comes through in some choices, like how much lives in the Explorer process, how much is shared in memory between processes, so that if one process dies and corrupts memory, it brings down other processes, that kind of thing, because of shared memory. So these are philosophical differences between the way you would write code on a Windows 95 platform and a Windows NT platform. And yeah, I don't think it caused a lot of friction, but it did mean that we had to change certain things, and they may have resented that we changed code they wrote. And Rust and React. Rust, I have not coded in, but if I understand it correctly, it's basically C, but with memory that is managed in such a way that you will not unknowingly corrupt memory, run over buffers, and that kind of thing. So the memory is much more controlled, but it's otherwise very accessible to you with pointers and so on. That sounds like a great idea to me. So it sounds like C with memory protection in a way, and I think that sounds like a really powerful paradigm. Haven't tried it, so I can't tell you a whole lot more educated than that. In terms of React, I'm liking it a lot. I'm especially liking the component model, where I can say this returns, a blah, and a blah is made up of these 5 objects, and each of those cascades into a bullet list with an object and a checkbox, and so on and so forth. It's been extremely powerful, as well as the mixing of JavaScript and HTML in whatever they call their little mixed language. That is a great way to write code. The debugging is actually also good in Visual Studio Code. So it is, I haven't had a lot of time to work on it, but the experience as a web developer took a huge step forward with React. That's all I know. Oh, and the 10 gigabit stuff. If you have suggestions for the 10 gigabit topic, I would love to hear those as well. The next one I was going to do was, when I installed 10 gigabit in my house, I was kind of shocked that when I went and actually instrumented and tested and used iPerf and measured from point to point, not everything was 10. In fact, 10 gigabits was pretty rare in between any 2 points in the house. That took a lot of debugging and changing of MTUs and stuff like that to get it to work. So I thought I would do an episode on chasing down actual performance issues and how to ensure good perf with 10 gigabit. But what else? So if there's other stuff you want to know about 10 gigabit, please let me know. Well, we're 2 hours in, so I'd like to give a big thanks to Glenn, my moderator, who's been feeding me millions of questions, and to the people who have put the questions forth, because a ton of great questions and not a lot of overlap with last time. So I've got quite a backlog of questions here, so I will try to parse through some of those so that when I open the next live stream, I can open with those while we're accumulating questions. So again, thanks for coming out, and in the meantime and in between time, yeah, can you imagine that I would blow that?